Hi, it's Andy from PCR Global, just providing a short video on general workplace risk assessment. So the risk assessment, this sort of tutorial is going to go through 1, 2, 3 things, some questions and answers, a review of the main components of a risk assessment, and also a worked example. So who is this going to be useful for? Well, it's going to be useful for anybody who's sort of sitting a risk assessment course. I must stress basic risk assessment, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So the first things first, risk assessment sort of terminology. I think I got about 7 questions there. So are there some key terms that we should know? And that's yes, because there's a number of terms associated with risk assessment. Now, what I would say is these terms, they can vary by country. They can vary even by organisation or even the course you're on. But these generally are those terms: hazard, hazardous event, likelihood, consequence, risk, risk assessment, and residual risk. Hazard. So what do we mean by the term hazards? If we look at some of the options we've got there, anything that's a potential to cause harm. A hazard is a measure of the chance that the hazardous event will occur. A hazard is the outcome of the hazardous event. And you can read 4 and 5 for yourself. So what do you think that is? A hazard is anything that has a potential to cause harm. Again, I must reiterate that this is dependent on any of the courses that you're on and the specific terminology. What is meant by a hazardous event? So there we've got 5 options, but it can't be 1 because we've just covered that. So just read through those. A hazardous event is when someone or something interacts with the hazard, and harm results. Now, let's be honest. Do you really need to remember that? Only if you're doing a certain type of course that has these certain type of definitions. So that really is important to bear in mind. What's meant by likelihood? Okay, so we've got a number of options there again. Likelihood is one of the main pieces of terminology. Okay, am I going to get run over? What is the likelihood? So a really important element. It's a measure of the chance that the hazardous event will occur. So likelihood, will it happen? Again, important terminology. Consequence, there's going to be an output, isn't it? So let's have a look at those. Anything that has a potential to cause harm, it can't be that. Consequent is a measure, it can't be that. The outcome of the hazardous event, and there you go. So now we've got likelihood and consequence that we've looked at, haven't we? Risk. So what is meant by the term risk? So for health and safety, it's quite specific when we think of that terminology. The combination of the likelihood of a hazardous event occurring and the consequence of the event. I must stress, health and safety terminology for risk is different to other terminology in other sort of disciplines. If we think of risk, I don't mean health and safety risk, I mean sort of business risk, there's going to be different terminology there. So I'm just going to jump through to my YouTube page, website I should say, my YouTube site, and look at the risk terminology we got here, the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And that actually comes from ISO 31000. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Of course, that can be financial, health and safety, security. So the effect of objectives can be anything to do with sort of those disciplines or those sort of outcomes. So it is important to stress. And if you also go on to look at one of the videos I've got online, I will take you through the risk management process. Again, it's slightly different. This is not health and safety related. It's business risk related. So it really is worth knowing. But at the end of the day, likelihood and consequence. What is going to happen? What is the severity going to be? And what's the likelihood of that happening? Residual risk, residue. So let's have a quick look. The level of risk that is left after control measures have been introduced. So we can think of that as residue, residual, what is left over. What is meant by the term risk assessment? A risk assessment is a careful examination of, what do we think? Machinery, hazardous materials, heavy items. Well, it's actually anything. So a risk assessment, careful examination of anything in the work environment that could cause injury or ill health. So that's it for that part. Now, the main components of a risk assessment. There's really three main components. And again, some risk assessments won't even have these three components. But what we can see here is a general risk assessment template. And we can see we've got likelihood, consequence, and then that risk rating. Not always will the template actually have likelihood and consequence on it. It really does depend. If we look at the UK Health and Safety Executive, this is the risk assessment template that they offer. What are the hazards? Similar. Who might be harmed? Similar. What you're already doing? Similar. What is missing is those numbers. That's missing from this risk assessment. And some people will say semi-quantitative, quantitative, qualitative. Ultimately, it depends on your risk assessment template that you're working from. That's why this in itself is generic. It's a generic look at a generic style risk assessment seen very regularly in organisations. So we have the template. What is important, if there is going to be some type of rating, that we have that rating calculator. We have what does likelihood mean, what does consequence mean, and then we have that action table. These are very important, and I'll come further onto that as we go along. So here's the form. Important work area. When you fill in the form out, make sure you are quite explanative. So if you are reading this risk assessment, if you're reading a risk assessment of somebody else, and they might have left the company, it's really important to be really clear. So the work area, the function, what work area are we looking at? What is the size of the work area? How many floors? How many people are working in it? And we might be considering people working outside of normal hours as well. But really be as specific as you can when we look at the work area. The task, again, be specific and describe the situation. We've got to be thinking about routine and non-routine tasks such as maintenance as well. And I often, when I do my consulting, I ask the organisation, do you have a specific risk assessment for maintenance? Have you done specific hazard identification for maintenance works? And more often than not, they don't have that. It's non-routine, and people will say, well, we don't do that often. And that's exactly why you do need that specific risk assessment. So here we've got examples, moving items from dispatch to the warehouse on a forklift truck. Again, that's quite explanative. Manually carrying boxes of paper from the storeroom to the training office on the first floor. Again, that is quite descriptive. And then we get across to the hazard. So if you are on a risk assessment course, quite often questions will come up. Name the types of hazard, or how many types of hazard. It really does depend what course you're on again. But ultimately, mechanical, physical, chemical, environmental, biological, psychosocial, or organizational, as some organizations call it. So we can categorize those. But what I always say to people, you don't just say the hazard is mechanical. You must describe what that hazard is. It's really important to be as descriptive as possible. The more descriptive you are, the more you can sort of understand, articulate, even to yourself. Just go over that hazard, and then you will find you'll dig in a little bit deeper. You'll find more controls because you'll spend more time thinking about it. So we've got mechanical, physical, chemical, environmental, biological, and organizational. Who might be harmed? A really important category. So we've got workers, contractors, members of the public, or even trespassers, young workers or trainees, new and expectant mothers, less able persons, or pre-existing physical or mental health conditions. I always iterate this over and over when I work with clients. When we're thinking about persons with pre-existing sort of conditions, if we're doing a noise risk assessment, which is a specific risk assessment, if the individual or individuals already have noise-induced hearing loss, then you have to protect that. You have to protect them. So your control measures, you're going to have to lower that noise level before you actually start implementing certain control measures required by the Control of Noise at Work regulations. So that's really important. So thinking about that category, contractors, yes, we must protect contractors. So ensure that you pick the right category, and all categories. How might they be harmed? Now this is important because I tend to always promote two elements to this, to answer this sort of, I won't say answer the question, but when you're working through your assessment, how the person could be harmed, but also what harm, what physical injuries could or obviously ill health sort of injuries can happen. So let's have a look. Example, the paintings on the top shelf in the paint store could fall onto someone's head, causing cuts and bruising, concussion, or even future headaches or vision problems. So we are being clear. We can see two elements in this part of our answer. Slipping on the tiled kitchen floor could cause cuts, bruises, damaged ligaments, and so on. So there's definitely two parts to that answer. Be clear. Existing control measures. So what are you already doing? So this existed in the HSE template as well. There'll probably be some controls in place, probably, and we should avoid writing none, especially if we're doing an assessment. So examples could be preventing contact with a hazard, and that's engineering controls. But so we could be saying something like barriers, guarding, enclosures, as it says here, or they could be safe systems of work or administrative controls if we're using the hierarchy of control, or personal protective equipment. Remember, that's always going to be the last line of defence. So this is a real important part when we look at the documentation. The risk rating calculator. So we can see there, this is what we've got to consider when we're doing that assessment. Now, if we were working from the HSE risk assessment template, you can see there are no numbers. So we wouldn't have to look what those numbers mean to make the calculation. We would just continue to write in the columns. For me, there's pros and there's cons to this. A lot of people want to see those numbers. Okay, that's without a doubt. They want to see colours. That, again, is without a doubt. And I'll always ask the organisation. If you are on a course, you potentially won't have any option. You may well be using the documentation or the risk assessment documentation provided by that course provider. Now, when we look at the risk rating calculator and the action level table, we've really got to be clear. Let's think about this. An organisation must determine the likelihood and the numbers, what they mean, the descriptors, same as the consequence, same as the action level table. The problem we have is obviously the wordage can be manipulated. The wordage can be copied from somewhere else. So it might not be relevant. So there can be a number of issues with this. However, if you do describe the right likelihoods and you describe the right consequences and you put in the right action level table that suits the situation and your company, then it can give you the potential to be more repetitive. And that's the wrong word, but more sort of more people will be able to read what it says on the tin there, and they'll be able to come up with their answers basically fixed on what you've got written in the risk rating calculator and the action level table. But if you write them wrong in the boxes in the first place, then they're obviously going to copy them wrong, and they're going to come up with sort of answers based on what you've got written in the boxes. Risk assessment is subjective without any level of a doubt. Now let's just think back to this. This is a simple workplace risk assessment. The only reason why I'm showing here the risk rating calculator with the numbers is that because that's what a lot of organizations have. So the first thing we're going to do is rate the perceived likelihood. So that could be 4. Okay, so we take our 4, then we're going to rate the perceived consequences. Again, that could be 4 major. And then what we're going to do is times those. Remember, risk is likelihood times consequence, and that's going to give us a 16. Now, let's analyze this a little bit further. What we don't have here in this example, likely. What do we mean by likely? When we come across and look at major, we do have some type of descriptor in this, more than 7 days absence for work. So that's quite helpful. I don't find this very helpful, but again, it's personal preference. But if we look at a very, very good document called BSEN 31010. Now this is Risk Management, Risk Assessment Techniques. Let's have a quick look. I want us to dive down, bear with me when I find it. I want us to have a look here, what I mean by descriptors. So bear with me when I claw my way down to the bottom. Bear with, and here we go. So when we start to look at the pros and cons of using this method, descriptor, likely, 5 all the way down to remotely possible. But look at the meaning. It's expected to occur within weeks. That is what's missing from that risk assessment template. So earlier on, the one we looked at, which we look at again, it had very unlikely, unlikely, fairly likely, but it didn't have what that meaning was. So unless we do that, then again, I'm not going to say it's guesswork because it's bringing us onto the target, but ultimately, it's not an exact science, and that really is what I'm saying. So what do we mean by likely? So the next step, okay, step 4, follow the risk rating action in the action level table. So that's taking us 16 and we can go down 15 to 16. Urgent action, take immediate action and stop activity if necessary, or maintain existing controls rigorously. If we are going to blindly follow this chart, we must remember that we could be blindly following the blind, and in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Really important this, I can't stress it enough. Personally, for a normal workplace risk assessment, I am pretty comfortable in just using this type of template from the HSE. Okay, moving on again. We're now going to look at a worked example. Okay, so let's go through it. So Andy, that's myself, that's the date we're doing the assessment. The time is in there, the work area. So now we've got engineering workshop. And within there, we've got forklift operating. We've got lathes, we've got milling machines, we've got welding sets. It's 50 square meters approximately. There's 6 workers, but 2 cleaners are in the general area between 09 and 10:30. So 8 in total, and we've got 1 floor. That is quite descriptive. So when I read and I think about forklifts, when I think about lathes, now I'm going to start thinking about metalworking fluids. When I think about welding sets, I'm going to think about argon risk. I'm going to think about acetylene risk. So just by describing that working area, it's really helping me understand the hazards and therefore what control measures need to be in the area. So what tasks are we going to assess? Because we could assess many tasks, couldn't we? The delivery and removal of workpiece items, metals. So we got sheets, blocks, bars with a forklift. The forklift enters the work area through the external shutter door and either drops or picks up items from the laydown or pickup areas next to the workstation before exiting the work area. That is quite a decent description of the task being assessed. And then we can work through it. What's the hazard? Forklift operations in the general area. Who might be harmed? Workers, cleaners, or visitors. That's anybody who's potentially going to get bumped by this forklift. How? Remember, put 2 things in there. The forklift could collide with someone when maneuvering in the work area, when dropping off or picking up work items, resulting in bruising, fractured bones, permanent disability. So by reading that, by being so clear, we really are able to initiate that thought process. And if somebody else is reading this as well, or we've got to describe this, we've got to provide this, I should say, to, let's just say, the facilities manager or the operations manager, to say, look, this is what can happen. This is why we do need to spend a little bit of extra money on control measures. What existing control measures do we have in this situation? Well, the driver is trained by an external company. I've got that down there because that's the fact in this situation. Workers are told at induction to give way to forklifts. So when the induction is being read, guys, you've got to give way to forklifts. So you could question that, couldn't you? Remember now, this is a situation that we're talking about, and that's what I'm saying has been said. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. Signage which highlights the forklift as a hazard. And then PPE is mandatory. So when we consider that, we now move into that risk rating. I've just popped up the risk rating calculator on the right hand side, and I'm giving the likelihood as a 3, which is fairly likely. Again, how am I gonna really come up with that? Am I saying fairly likely because somebody got run over last week and the week before and the week before that and the week before that? Well, I'm sure if it was that likely, then that's more like very likely, isn't it? It's not an exact science. It's really not. But I'm coming up with fairly likely. And the consequence I'm saying there, I've given it as a 4, and that's major. So that's more than 7 days absence, because that could be a broken bone, couldn't it? Could it be even worse, of course. 3 4s gives us our 12. Once we've got that 12, now what is that telling us within the action level table? Improve within a specified time scale. So how good is that? How good is that? What type of time scale? 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months? And that again is the weakness that can exist in these action level tables. But remember, we can't be specific for every single hazard and control measure. That's the difficulty in risk assessment when using risk rating calculators and action level tables. So, do we need any additional controls? On the left hand side, now I brought up the hierarchy of control. Easy AP, eliminate, substitute, engineer, administrative controls and PP. There are multiple hierarchies of controls. These are the general type that you will see on a normal risk assessment course, but please do not think they are the only ones, because hierarchies of control exist in other specific legislation as well in the UK. So additional controls, what are we going to say we're going to do? And I've just put a number 1 here. Implement a 5 metre rule. That forklift is not operated within 5 metres of people, and people must not walk within 5 metres of the forklift. Note, a task-specific risk assessment must be completed if a 5 metre rule is going to be breached. So that's what I'm thinking. Okay, implement that control. Bear with. And then I've also, the second one, provide a recorded training to the forklift driver and the workers on the new 5 metre rule. So we're bringing in a new sort of safe system, aren't we? And we're going to ensure that we're putting that training in place as well. Include that 5 metre rule in the workers and the contractors' visitors induction form. 4, install pedestrian segregation and barriers and also painted walkways. Lots of times there are accidents and incidents, and that's basically what gets said. Segregation wasn't good enough. If we do all that, we should reduce that likelihood down to very unlikely. Remember, what are we saying? Now, once in 100 years? Well, we're all going to be dead by then, aren't we? So it's not an exact science, but definitely we can see a reduction in likelihood. The consequence, potentially not going to change, because if we get hit, we get hit. Okay, if we get hit, that's basically going to be the same severity, isn't it? So that major. 1 4 is 4. Have we reduced it? Yes, we have. Okay, so we've brought it now down to monitor. Look to improve at the next review if there is a significant change. Actions. Now what are we going to do? Number 1, authorization to be given by the managing director and the new 5 metre rule to be documented by the workshop manager. So again, quite specific. We really are bringing people into this. Number 2, to be done by the workshop manager. So 1 done by 1, 2 done by 2. So you can see I'm just marrying them up. Human resource manager is what? They're responsible to include the 5-metre rule in the workers and the contractors' visitors induction form. And then 4, the workshop manager to initiate an internal project to install segregation and also paint the designated walkways. All that's left to do now is marry up those dates. As we can see, we've just married up those dates. So if we were to put in these additional controls, we should reduce the likelihood of an accident occurring. It does look now that we have a risk assessment. We've assessed the delivery and removal of workplace items. We've been pretty clear about what's going on in the area. What we haven't done is risk assessed metalworking fluids. We haven't risk assessed noise. We haven't risk assessed vibration. And we must go on and obviously risk assess those as well. So that is the end of that little workshop. However, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to make sure that I leave you with the understanding that that type of risk assessment that we've looked at there, if we're going to do a risk assessment for hand-arm vibration, if we're going to do a risk assessment for DESIR, then ultimately within these regulations themselves, there are specific requirements for risk assessment. So you really must realise that we've got exposure limit values if we're doing vibration. Noise is going to be the same. So just doing a basic risk assessment on a template like this or on a template like we've just looked at, okay, is probably not going to cut it. We need to do a lot of certain other things. The vibration risk assessment, estimating exposures. So we can use the calculator that's available online for us. So that really is sort of important to consider. If we start risk assessing occupational health, again, this is different. So again, noise, metalworking fluids. So there are specific styles of risk assessment that we should be making sure we put in place. If you are interested in doing some risk assessment training with us, then please just call me direct. Thanks for watching. I really hope that does help. And the biggest thing to take away is numbers, colours, or no numbers or colours. An organisation will have a preference. If you are lucky enough to be given that preference, personally for me, a general workplace risk assessment, I really am just going to go down this simple method from the Health and Safety Executive. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching. Stay safe, stay healthy, and always stay productive.